Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. What I want to do with this video is tell you as best as I can what the names of the runes were in Elder Futhark, the oldest known version of the runic alphabet. Now, we don't actually ever have the names of the runes in Elder Futhark written down during the period when Elder Futhark was used. The earliest texts that have the names of the runes come from about 800 AD or CE, which is at least 800 years after runes had first been developed and used to write early Germanic languages like the ancestors of English and the Scandinavian languages. So we're always going to have to be working backwards trying to reconstruct what those letter names are. And so the letter names that you see repeated everywhere online, you ask, now I guess in 2026, it's, you ask ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever, it's always going to be fehu or urus and thurusas, etc. Those are probably real, most of them. I actually think there are three rune names that we can't reconstruct confidently. But we need to be aware that they are back projections from a later time. So let's talk about this a little bit with a look at those sources too. Although I have videos that look at these sources in much more detail. Now, in Elder Futhark, like in many other alphabets of the ancient world, we have a fair number of inscriptions where someone has just written out the entire alphabet of 24 letters in this case. This is probably the oldest one. This is the Silverstone from Gotland in Sweden. And notice that it does list runes in a different order slightly than you have probably seen in most places online. So we have the P rune and then this rune, the exact value of which is uncertain in the reverse order from what you usually see presented online. And then you have the D and the O in a reverse order from what you usually see presented online. But I usually follow this order because being probably the earliest inscription with the whole order, I'm just presuming this may be closest to the original. It's interesting to note that just about all inscriptions that list out the entire Futhark alphabet have started the same way, right? They have the same first half, the same first 12 letters. It's always in the second half where you get some inconsistency and disagreement. And that probably reflects some artifact of how people learned the order of the letters. In fact, I would point out that really where you get the most variation is if you break the runes up into three groups of eight, which they are broken up into three groups in the younger Futhark, then those groups are like this. And really all the disagreement is in the second half of the second group of eight and the second half of the third group of eight. Again, this is probably an artifact of how people learned this order, whatever exactly the original order was. Now, the order that people actually usually cite on the internet is this one from two bracteates, one from Vadstena and one from Mariadan. These have sort of the classic order that everybody bases their order on. I don't know exactly why people favor this one online, but notice where we've got that mystery rune reversed with the P. The P is actually just written as another B, like the B over here, but then you got that O and that D. Okay, where do we actually know rune names from? So again, we don't know the names of the runes from the time when Elder Futhark was used. We know the names of the runes from Old Norse, from Old English, and indirectly from Gothic. So in Old Norse and in Old English, we have rune poems. We have an Old Norwegian rune poem and an Old Icelandic rune poem in Old Norse. Now, in the Old Norse period, so after about 700 AD in Scandinavia, the alphabet that was used was the 16-letter Younger Futhark, which does not have eight of the letters of Elder Futhark, which means we don't have Scandinavian versions of eight of the letter names. Now, in Gothic, we also don't have a direct Gothic language source. What we have is around 800, Alcuin, an English scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote down what he said were the names of the letters of the Gothic alphabet. The Gothic alphabet appears, I think, you know, definitely to have influence from runes. People argue about this though, but it's not exactly the runic alphabet. But it appears that the letters of the Gothic alphabet largely had names that were based on the names of the equivalent runes. Now, the person writing this down or transmitting it to Alcuin didn't know Gothic, and so the forms of words look a little weird. That's why I have them in quotations under Gothic, and then in parentheses, I have the equivalent standardized spelling Gothic word. This is still an important reference point for us. In Old English, we also have a lot of other sources that list the names of runes. We also have a lot of use in Old Norse and Old English manuscripts that are written in the Roman alphabet and our alphabet, where the word that is the name of the rune is represented by the rune. In Old Norse, we particularly often see this in a poem like Havamal, and this is represented in my edition of the Old Norse text in the Wanderer's Havamal, where the old M rune stands for mother, which means man. Or likewise in Beowulf, you see a rune that will stand for the word that is the name of the rune. So, for example, the old O rune will stand for uh, Aevil, inherited property. The runes, the names of which we can reconstruct confidently, all have names that begin with the sound that the rune represents. So they're acrophonic. So surely the names are part of the learning process. And we don't otherwise know exactly what the names are there for, right? It doesn't seem that while the word can definitely, the name, the rune can definitely represent the word that is its name, but we don't know if the name is being evoked as such. We don't have the concept as being evoked as such by its name, right? I don't know that writing the F rune, the name of which means money or cattle, is sort of summoning money or cattle. It doesn't really seem like runes are used that way, even though that's mostly what modern people want them to be used as, right? Modern people mostly want these to stand for concepts. They want this F rune to stand for money or cattle. They don't want it to stand for the sound F, which is really fundamentally what it stands for. It's hard to say. It definitely looks like there's some use of runes and acronyms. They definitely do sometimes stand for their names, but they're standing then for the word, right? They're shortening the writing of an inscription in runes or a manuscript in the Roman alphabet. They're not necessarily being used to evoke, magically summoning the thing that uh, is their name. All right, let's talk about these names, the ones that are more or less certain. So the first letter, easy, it's fehu. Old Norse fe, money or cattle. Old English feoch, money or cattle. The Gothic also looks very much like the standard Gothic word fehu, money or cattle. Fehu, easy. Second one, uraz. This is probably aurochs, the wild animal that is the ancestor of our domestic cattle. However, that meaning of this name is only preserved in the Old English rune poem. In the Old Norwegian rune poem, the same, or should I say, a homophonous word, ur, meaning slag, is what's represented in the rune poem as the name of this rune. And in the Old Icelandic rune poem, it is ur, a light rain. Um, the presumption that the original name is that aurochs meaning is based on the Old English poem being earlier, so giving it kind of a little priority just for that reason. But also, it pairs nicely with Fey, which is the domestic cattle, in the name of the rune just before it. So it could be one of the other meanings, but I think the Aurochs meaning is probably a strong guess there. On the other hand, we tend to prefer the reconstruction of the name of the next rune based on the Old Norse sources and call it Thorisaz. That letter in Icelandic or Old Norse or Old English stands for the th sound in thorn or thin or thor. It's actually based on the rune, borrowed from the runes into our alphabet. So in Old Norse, that's Thors. This is an enemy of the gods, commonly called a giant. I prefer a term like anti-god or just use the Old Norse words, Thors, Jotun. These are greater supernatural beings who oppose the gods. In Old English, it just means thorn. That's also the name that this letter has in the Roman alphabet in Old English and in Old and Modern Icelandic. It's generally thought that since the Old Norse name has some sort of pagan, religious, or sacral valence, that would be replaced in Old English with something common and everyday like thorn rather than the other way around. And that's probably about right. The name attested for the Gothic letter Thuth, it's hard to tell what exactly that's intended to represent. That actually looks more like the name of the Greek letter that it's roughly equivalent to theta. The name of the A rune is very likely to be Ansus. That would mean, so that's actually the singular in Proto-Germanic of the word that in the plural we know as Asir, modern Icelandic Aesir, the name of the higher family of the Norse gods. So this is a pagan god. That is the meaning of this name in Old Icelandic, in the Old Icelandic rune poem. And then in the Old Norwegian rune poem, it is called Os, and it means river mouth. Old English it's called Os too, and comes to mean an O sound rather than an A sound. Um, this it's a little hard to say what it's supposed to be in the Old English rune poem. You could read it as like mouth. You could also read it as God there. So God is very likely to be the original meaning. And in Gothic, that word would have been Ansus. The fifth rune, Raido, standing for R, pretty strongly backed up by Old Norse Reið, Old English Rad, and Gothic Reda. That just looks like a uninformed spelling of the exact Gothic word. So that's riding, the act of riding, like you would ride a horse. The K rune, the sixth rune, a little bit of disagreement. I would reconstruct Kauna based on the Old Norse just because I like Old Norse best. That's called Kaun in Old Norse, which means ulcer. In Old English, it's called Cain, which means torch. So you got a little bit of disagreement there. You could reconstruct the name from Old English. The Gothic name attested by Alcuin doesn't seem to line up with that at all, and it's hard to tell what's going on with Cosma or whatever that's supposed to be. For the G rune, which looks like an X, we reconstruct Gyevo. That Greek beta represents a fricative B. So basically, a little bit like a V, but like in Spanish, you make that with both of your lips together. V, not V. So Gyevo. This rune is not used in Old Norse in the Younger Futhark, but its name would be Kjov if it had survived there. The Old English is Yivu, which is generosity. And then Gothic Geva looks like exactly the right word we'd expect for Gothic gift. At least, again, as heard by someone who didn't know how to spell Gothic. With the W rune, which looks something like a P, we have Wunyo as the reconstructed name, really just based on Old English where it's win, joy. Um, Gothic winna could be the same thing. It seems a little odd for this word. The word in Gothic probably would have been, wunya, a little bit more like that Proto-Germanic reconstruction. So hard to say if someone heard the Gothic name like that very wrong, or if maybe the Gothic name was actually something quite different. Now, in the second group of eight, now in Old Norse, it's called an aht, H-T-T. In Proto-Germanic, so at the time Elder Futhark was used, that would be Aihtiz, if this is the meaning, um, one's, well, a family, so it's a family of runes. That acht could also come from group of eight, which is Ahtiz in Proto-Germanic, and I favor that a little bit more. So our second group of eight, we can reconstruct the name of the H rune. It's probably Haglaz or Hagalaz, based on Old Norse Hagal, Old English Hail. Gothic Hall also looks like a decent representation of the word hagel in Gothic there. This means hail, as in what falls from the sky. And both, I think it's the Old Norwegian and the Old English rune poem have a similar little poetic description of hail as the coldest or whitest of corns, which may go back to some putative uh, Elder Futhark rune poem. Of course, no Elder Futhark rune poem is preserved for us because we don't have the Elder Futhark rune names. Um, I have made an imaginative uh, original Elder Futhark rune poem in Proto-Germanic, however, that's based on my notions about what the names are. A little bit different than what I have today, but I made it about a year ago. The N rune, the second rune in this group, is now this. That means affliction. This is the word that becomes English need, but its meaning in older Germanic languages is more like the emergency, the affliction that puts you in a state of need than it is like just I need water. So that's Old Norse náðr, Old English need. Those line up really nicely. That would be noths in Gothic. The word Alcuin records doesn't really look very much like this, but no real reason to think the Old Norse and Old English don't point us in the right direction since they have the same word there. Then we've got the I rune, Isaz, ice. based on Old Norse is, Old English is, and what looks very much like Gothic is, all meaning ice, solid. Then we have the old Y rune. We could probably reconstruct this as Yera, meaning year. That would give us Old Norse or and Old English year, meaning year. In Gothic, this would be yer. Alcuin's text makes it look a little funny, hard to say, but no reason, again, if Old Norse and Old English point us toward the same word, no reason to think that that isn't the original word. Then we've got three where I don't think we can actually confidently reconstruct these names. I think I said earlier that there are three runes where we can't reconstruct confidently a name. It may be more like four. Let me come back to these because these are the hardest cases. The last rune in this group is the S rune. I'd reconstruct this name as Sola, assuming this was a strong neuter noun based on it being neuter in Gothic as well as in a lot of other old Indo-European languages like Sanskrit. I think that that older data points toward a neuter rather than the feminine or masculine you sometimes see this reconstructed with. So you'll see different reconstructions based on what gender people think this word was. I'm going to say neuter, uh, pointed to by all of the source languages, especially Old Norse sol, meaning sun. In the third group, I think we can confidently assume that the name of the T rune, the first letter there, is uh, Tiwaz. That would be an earlier Tewaz, which this word is actually written out on the oldest inscription that you can start a fight by saying this could possibly be runes that we know of. That is the helmet, one of the helmets found at Negau or Negova, Slovenia. I've made a video about this and talked about this in several other places. Anyway, the Old Norse name of this rune, Tyr, that is the name of the one-handed god, and his one-handedness is referenced in, I think it's the Old Icelandic rune poem. Again, that having some kind of pagan sacral significance points to that being probably a really old name, more likely to be replaced than to be replacing something older. So in Old English, where we have Tyr, T-I-R, it looks like it means a star, maybe a constellation based on the way its name is riddled at in the Old English rune poem. This probably later. The Gothic that Alcuin records Tews or something that could point to a Gothic Teus, which would be the name of the one-handed god in Gothic if that were preserved. So I think it's pretty, we can pretty strongly point to this as being the name of that god. B, Berkana. This is some kind of tree. In Old English, it's Beork, which looks like birch, but actually the description and the way this is referred to, not just in the Old English rune poem, makes it look like it might actually be talking about a poplar tree, not a birch. The Old Norse name is Bjarkan, which also is not exactly the name of the birch tree. The name of the birch tree is Bjork, right? And of course, in its modern Icelandic pronunciation, Björk, that's a common woman's name in Iceland now. So this may not be the same tree as the birch. It may be a similar root, but it may mean the poplar rather than the birch. At any rate, it's a tree based on the way that its name is hinted at in the rune poems. Gothic Berkna doesn't disagree with that at all. The E rune, we don't use this in Old Norse. This rune has disappeared in the Younger Futhark, but based on Old English eoh, which means horse. By the way, that is the word that is the first element in the names of people from Rohan and Tolkien's world, like Eowyn and Eomer. Eowyn actually combines the names of two runes, the E and the W. She's horse joy, the one who has her joy in horses. Anyway, this would point us back to Proto-Germanic ehwaz, that may strike you, if you know anything about linguistics, as being a perfect Grimm's law cognate to Latin equus and Greek hippos, and it is. This is the old Indo-European root for horse. That does survive in Old Norse yor, but again, the rune it's not used. The Gothic is there could point toward what the Gothic word is, which is eos. Actually, the Gothic word for horse is only attested in ehotundi, horse tooth, but eos would be what we would expect there. This letter that you see me using, the Roman alphabet that combine H and U, stands for the hua sound in an earlier American English or fossilized American English pronunciation of a word like what or whip, like what I use. The M rune means man, easily fixed for us by the fact that it means exactly that in Old Norse Mather, Old English man, Gothic mana. You'll see this reconstructed different ways, sometimes as manas. Depends on whether you think that Old Norse or Gothic has the earlier more archaic inflection of this word. I'm going to go with Gothic just because it's the more archaic attested language and because I can see a path for that weak noun to become a strong noun a little bit more easily than the other way around. So I'm going to reconstruct mono rather than monas. The L, lagus, pointed to us very nicely by Old Norse logr and Old English lagu, that's lake, pond, body of water, still body of water anyway. The Gothic laws also seems to point in that direction. Then we've got a rune that looks like a diamond. I'm going to come back to that and talking about the hard ones at the end here. Then we've got the D. By the way, this is a D at the beginning of words, but in the middle of words after vowels, it's a the sound, like in then or other. This is the same pattern you see in Spanish, right? Where if a word starts with a D, it means D, right? Diez. But if it is after a vowel, it stands for the, like amado. So anyway, Old English is day. We also have an inscription in Old Norse that's in the younger Futhark, but still uses this D rune to stand for a man's name, Dagar. I should have put that on here. That means day too, so I think we can pretty confidently point to that as the name. Alcuin gives the Gothic name as Das, acceptable enough as a bad pronunciation of Gothic Doc's day. And then Old English and Gothic point us to the O rune, uh, being Othala, inherited property. The vowel change in Old English is standard I mutation, same reason that it's Wednesday, not Wednesday, for the day of Odin or Woden in English. And Gothic just looks like someone who didn't understand what they were hearing in Gothic, but the Gothic word is Othal. It's a word that we know from the Gothic Bible. Now let's talk about the hard rune names. The very, very hardest is this one that has, it's a straight line with a diagonal bar at the top and a diagonal bar at the bottom on the other side. We don't know what this letter represented. You'll see a lot of confident reconstructions of names, usually something like Ahaz. I don't think that you can confidently reconstruct this at all. Now, when I say we don't actually know what it represented, I mean that in the first 500 years in which runes are used, we never see this used to write out a word. We only see it when they write out the entire alphabet, coming in about this place in the second group of eight. So it's not actually used to write out words. It's as if we had people reciting the alphabet A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but we never saw anybody actually use the letter G to write a word. Okay. So when we start seeing this used to write words in Old English in the second half of the first millennium AD, it's used lots of different ways. It's used as both a vowel and a consonant, so very, very hard to be confident about what this originally meant. According to the Old English rune poem, the letter that looks like this is called Eo. That means yew, as in yew tree. Okay? That's why it's often reconstructed as having a name like Ahaz. But in Old English, we also see in some of our sources for the Old English runes a rune that has the branches just a little bit bent, and it's called Quaorth and stands for the qua sound, like in quoth or question. And in Gothic, the letter that doesn't look like this, a lot of the Gothic letters don't look like the runes. Again, the Gothic alphabet is not based, 100% on runes. The Gothic has a letter that looks kind of like a U that stands for qua, and Alcuin says its name is Quertra. I wonder, and I've talked about this, developed this quite a bit in another video I put up last month, I think, if this letter could once possibly have actually stood for that sequence qua. Uh, the Old English and the Gothic agreeing about this weird looking name that we can't easily explain except as a borrowing from a Celtic tree name. And I do think that it's quite likely that runes were an alphabet learned from a Celtic speaking people in the Alps. Remember, Celtic does not mean old and British. Celts were all over the world, all over Europe and Asia Minor and the ancient world. At any rate, I think that this could possibly be a letter that once stood for qua. That's going to be my new unusual position on this letter, and there's a lot of unusual positions on this letter. This just happens to be mine. I think this is the kind of letter that could easily be forgotten over time in the first few centuries of an alphabet's use because it's a sequence of two sounds, right? It's ka plus wa, so why not just write the K and the W? Why learn this whole extra letter? But it keeps getting passed down as part of the alphabet, even by people who don't use it anymore because people are reluctant to remove letters from alphabets. Look at the fact that we've never removed K or Q, even though they're redundant with C. And we haven't done that since the Etruscans learned those three letters for K 2,700 years ago in the sequence of alphabets passed down to us. I have another series of videos with Dr. Luke Gordon talking about the history of our alphabet that you can look at if you want. So maybe that's qua. Maybe this letter, the diamond-shaped one, I've wondered if that could have actually originally meant hua rather than ing. Our source for it being called ing and meaning the ing sound is just Old English. We actually don't really have Elder Futhark inscriptions where we can definitely point at this letter in isolation and say that it stands for ing. We can sometimes see it with a vertical line through it standing for the vowel plus consonant ing, but that may be a different letter or a different phenomenon entirely. Gothic does have a letter that Alcuin says is called where. That's often reported as where. That's the letter that stands for the wh sound in Gothic. Again, the sound in what or whip. That would be a letter that would be quite useful in writing an old Germanic language because that sound, believe it or not, even though it only survives today in the speech of Stewie and me, was present 2,000 years ago when the ancestors of English and it's still there in Gothic, still there in Old Norse, it's there in the ancestor of German and Dutch back then. Would have been quite useful. Now, Alcuin does report that Gothic has a letter called Engus, which does look like the Old English rune name, ing, but do we know that that was applied to the same rune? When, for one thing, the Old English rune doesn't look like this anymore. The Gothic letter that name is used for certainly doesn't. It looks like an X, and it's only used to write, for example, the name of Christ, words from Greek that use the letter chi that look like this. So maybe that's the name of another rune originally, and just possibly that Engu's name could be the name of the Z rune, the letter that looks like a Greek psi, and that, if you want to get into my thoughts about the origins of runes, I wonder is actually a repurposed Greek psi from that letter that Celts might have learned from Etruscans, might have learned from Greeks. See my other videos, especially maybe that recent video about runes in the Gothic alphabet for more thoughts about the origins of runes. It's not really what I'm talking about here. This rune is called Yr, which means bow in the Old Icelandic rune poem, but means yew in the Old Norwegian rune poem. So notice that yew tree meaning that is the same as Eoch, the yew tree name of the rune that is the name of the total mystery rune in the Old English. So something has gone wrong here, right? This is probably the name of an old rune, but which one? And which one has this been misapplied to? The Z sound cannot start words in Old Germanic languages, so whatever its name was, it must have started with something else besides its own name. The Gothic letter doesn't really help us here. Ezek, what is that? That actually, it's been proposed that's from the Latin name of Z, id, zeta, zeta itself. So that doesn't help us much. Just like which rune was this the name of? I think pretty likely it's the name of the Z because the Z can begin with anything, but Angus could also be an alternative early name of the Z rune because again, you cannot start a word with Z, so whatever word was the name of the Z rune, it didn't start with Z, it probably ended with Z, and there's more words that end in Z than probably anything else in Proto-Germanic. So I don't think you could ever quite confidently say what the name of the Z was. But I think there's like three possibilities here. Also, by the way, in Old English, you'll sometimes see the name of the cited as something like Ailch, so elk. But in fact, in the Old English rune poem, it's called Ailk sedge, which is clearly some kind of water plant. And it looks like it may even specifically be a papyrus reed. The P is another problem. There are not many words in Old Germanic languages that start with P or even have P. So the Old English rune poem pointing us to a name Peorth and the Gothic pointing us to a name Pertra looks like a tree name. This could again be a borrowing from a Celtic language's tree name, in which case you have a really interesting situation in Gothic where Pertra and Quertra look like they're from two different Celtic dialects but are the same word because P Celtic and Q Celtic are what we call the respective families of Welsh and Irish, where earlier quas remain quas in Irish but become pus in Welsh. Uh, does that reflect some kind of intensive contact over the years with people speaking lots of different Celtic dialects using early alphabets that had different kinds of influence on the runes? I don't know. but I don't think that we can confidently reconstruct exactly what the form of this word was in Proto-Germanic, something like Peor or Pertra. But, what was that? It doesn't look like a native word. Um, Perthra, Pertra, something along those lines, but probably a little bit unrecoverable, irrecoverable. So there you have what I think are 20 rune names that we can confidently say were there in Elder Futhark. I think 4 rune names are impossible to confidently reconstruct because they have contradictory or insufficient information from our sources, and our sources are all later than Elder Futhark. And if you want to know more about runes, it's a lot more about runes on this channel. If you are interested in Norse myth, you should read the original sources of Norse mythology, which include the Poetic Edda, the poems that were transmitted orally from the Viking Age till they were written down in the 1200s in Iceland. I have translated these in a second revised expanded edition, which is much improved over the first edition, which uh, I was always pleased with the good reception of the first edition, but I think the second edition improves quite a bit. It's also a really nice looking book. So if you want to support this channel, check out that book, check out more videos, check out the Patreon where you can get live access to interviews with all kinds of fantastic academic experts on subjects like Old Norse and runes and Norse mythology, and participate in a great Discord community where people are talking about those subjects in an informed, welcoming, friendly way every day, every hour. So thank you so much for your time. And from beautiful Colorado inside where the mics work, I am wishing you all the very best.